In June 1916, after 400 years of oppression, the Arabs began a revolt throughout the Arabian Peninsula to gain independence from the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The British supported the uprising with arms and money, as well as a 27-year-old military intelligence officer, Captain T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence proved to be an inspirational leader and highly skilled at guerrilla warfare in the desert wastelands of Arabia. He led the Arabs in numerous raids against the Turkish railroad in the deserts of the Hejaz region. These raids cut off supplies and tied down thousands of Turkish troops, which otherwise would have been deployed against the Allied armies fighting in Palestine and Mesopotamia. For over 2 years, Lawrence was the guiding force behind the Arab revolt as the Arab army fought its way to the ultimate goal of Damascus. Lawrence was one of the greatest wartime raiders of the 20th century. His exploits in the desert were recorded for posterity by the American journalist Lowell Thomas, who helped to create the legend that became Lawrence of Arabia. Thomas Edward Lawrence was born on August 16, 1888, at the height of the British Empire. His father was an Anglo-Irish landowner named Thomas Chapman. Chapman left his wife to live with the children's governess and assumed the name of Lawrence. They had 5 sons together. Thomas was the second born. His mother, Sarah, was the dominant figure in the family. She fervently believed in education as the key to advancement. The family moved to Oxford, where all the sons went to the city high school for boys. Lawrence excelled in scripture and history and became fascinated by biblical lands. In 1907, Lawrence competed for a place at Oxford University to study history. He came in 13th out of 4,675 candidates. At Oxford, he came under the influence of David Hogarth, a highly respected member of the academic establishment and a major player in the murky world of British military intelligence. With Hogarth's encouragement, Lawrence visited the Near East for the first time in 1909. Alone and living frugally, Lawrence undertook a 3-month walking tour of Syria and Palestine during the hottest time of the year. He covered 1,100 miles and spent much of the time visiting castle ruins of the Crusaders. He made many drawings and plans reflecting his deep interest in military history. These were incorporated into his university thesis, for which he gained a first-class honors degree in 1910. He also joined the Officer Training Corps, where he developed an expertise in firearms. He could shoot a pistol with either hand and always hit his target. Lawrence left Oxford University in 1910 and spent much of the next 4 years in the Near East. He joined a British Museum archaeological expedition on a dig at Carchemish on the Euphrates River in Syria, searching for artifacts of the 4,000-year-old Hittite Empire. Under the tutelage of the expedition leader, Leonard Woolley, who was a close friend of Hogarth, Lawrence cataloged the excavated finds, managed the Arab workforce, and acted as official photographer. He became fluent in Arabic and developed a great affinity for the local Arabs. He displayed a natural leadership among them and often resolved their family disputes and problems. During his time at Carchemish, Lawrence acquired a deep loathing for the Turks and their oppressive Ottoman Empire. For more than 400 years, the native Arabs had been subjected to a cruel regime of occupation and persecution by the Turkish army. To the British, the extensive but weak Ottoman Empire was valuable as a buffer against Russian ambitions to acquire a warm water naval port in the Mediterranean or the Near East. But the German Empire of Kaiser Wilhelm II was now re-equipping the Turkish army and building a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad. This threatened British interests in the Near East, including the Suez Canal, the vital link to Britain's empire in India and the Far East. Coincidentally, the archaeological dig at Carchemish was close to the railroad, and Lawrence took many photographs of it. Though unproven, it is probable that this was at the request of British military intelligence. In January 1914, Lawrence joined the Palestine Exploration Fund as an archaeologist working on digs in the Turkish-occupied Sinai region bordering the vital Suez Canal. The fund was financed by British military intelligence. Lord Kitchener, the British Army commander in Cairo, was using it as a cover for making military maps of the Sinai. Whether Lawrence was or was not officially employed by British intelligence has never been made clear, but the experience he gained would prove invaluable. Lawrence also traveled extensively on the Turkish-controlled Hejaz Railroad, which carried Muslim pilgrims to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The flames of Arab nationalism were beginning to smolder under the leadership of the Sharif of Mecca, Sheikh Ali ibn Hussein. In 1914, one of the four sons of Hussein, Prince Abdullah, asked Lord Kitchener for British support to back an Arab revolt against the Turks. But Britain refused because it did not want to be drawn into a war with the Ottoman Empire. Throughout his time in the Near East, Lawrence was completely focused and driven, developing great endurance. He believed implicitly in the importance of one's individual will. As he later wrote, "I wanted to write my will across the stars." In June 1914, Lawrence returned to England to complete a report on the Sinai expedition. He was living in Oxford when Britain declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary on August 4th. In November, Turkey joined the Central Powers and Britain was drawn into a war with the Ottoman Empire. Turkish troops posed a direct threat to the Suez Canal in Egypt and British oil wells in Persia. Lawrence's expertise in the Near East was soon in demand, and although still a civilian, he was posted to Egypt, arriving on December 15th. By 1915, the fighting on the Western Front in France and Flanders deteriorated into trench warfare. Britain and France were locked in a war of attrition with Germany, which cost all sides a great deal of blood. Despite huge losses on the Western Front, the British Army had to reinforce its garrison in Egypt to bolster the defense of the Suez Canal. The extra support was timely, as the Turks mounted an attack in February 1915. The Turkish offensive was quickly rebuffed, but the British remained on the defensive as men and supplies were directed elsewhere. The Allied High Command decided to mount a naval and amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula with the intention of capturing Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. At dawn on April 25, 1915, an Allied force, including a substantial Australian and New Zealand contingent, made simultaneous landings at Gallipoli against heavy machine gun fire. Within days, the offensive failed against a determined Turkish defense, and a stalemate ensued. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the British mounted an offensive from Basra toward Baghdad. After a decisive cavalry victory at Kut, General Charles Townshend led a British expedition, but the Turks defeated them just 20 miles shy of Baghdad. Townshend fell back toward Kut and came under siege. The thousands of wounded were sent downriver to Basra in a foul hospital ship in which the helpless men lay, their wounds crawling with maggots. By early summer of 1915, the British operations in the Near and Middle East ground to a halt. It was clear that they had underestimated the Ottoman Empire. For Lieutenant Lawrence in the Cairo Intelligence Office, these were trying times as well. In May, he suffered a personal tragedy when his brother Frank died while fighting on the Western Front. 4 months later, his brother Will also died after only 1 week of active service with the Royal Flying Corps. In July 1915, Sheikh Hussein approached the British authorities in Cairo, once again seeking support for an Arab insurrection against the Turks. This time, the British agreed to set up the Arab Bureau to coordinate the revolt, and Captain Lawrence was put on its staff. Lawrence became fully involved in military intelligence, undertaking secret missions across the region, including an attempt to bribe the Turkish commander besieging Kut. But the bribe was refused. By April 1916, General Townsend had lost too many men and was forced to surrender. On his return to Cairo on May 26, 1915, Lawrence met up with his old university mentor, the spy master David Hogarth, who was now in charge of the Arab Bureau. On June 5th, Sheikh Ali ibn Hussein fired the first symbolic shot of the Arab revolt with attacks on the Turkish garrisons at Jeddah and Medina. The Arab revolt had begun, and Lawrence's dreams were becoming a reality. He wrote, "All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find that it was vanity. For the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, where they may act their dreams with open eyes to make it possible. This I did. I meant to make a new nation." For Lawrence, it was time for action. In 1916, the focus of the war in the Middle East returned to Palestine, but the Allies were unable to defeat the heavily entrenched Turks. With the outbreak of the Arab Revolt, the British High Command in Cairo realized the value of opening a second front against the Turks in the Hejaz region, which would divert Turkish troops from Palestine. Supported by the fire of British gunboats, the Arabs captured the port city of Jeddah on June 10th. 3 days later, the holy city of Mecca was liberated. But the poorly armed Bedouin tribesmen were routed by the strong Turkish garrison at Medina. Medina was situated at the end of the Hejaz Railroad, which was the principal Turkish supply line in the region. Even so, the revolt quickly spread among the Arab tribes determined to expel the Turkish army from Arabia. However, the horse and camel-mounted nomads suffered heavy losses in their attacks against fortified Turkish positions. With the number of casualties mounting, morale suffered and several Arab clans ceased to support the revolt. Meanwhile, a strong Turkish garrison of 12,000 men remained in Medina at the end of the Hejaz Railroad, where it posed a barrier to any Arab expansion northward. Opposing them was an Arab army divided into 3 units, with Hussein's sons heading each. The eldest, Prince Ali, had about 5,000 men, Prince Abdullah about 4,000 defending Mecca, and Prince Faisal 7,000. There was concern in Cairo about the progress of the Arab revolt. Sir Ronald Storrs, a noted Arabist, was dispatched to Jeddah on October 13th to assess the situation and determine what was needed for the revolt to continue. Captain Lawrence went with him as an interpreter and field intelligence officer. One of the priorities was to identify a single military leader for the Arab army to replace the existing inefficient structure of 3 separate forces. Lawrence held talks with each of the sons of the Sharif of Mecca. Neither Ali nor Abdullah impressed him as military men. Lawrence then made his first ever journey on a camel during a 2-day trip to Wadi Safra, deep in the desert, to meet the third son, Prince Faisal. Lawrence later wrote, "I felt at first glance that this was the man I had come to Arabia to seek, the leader who would bring the Arab revolt to full glory." In his subsequent report, Lawrence advocated military and financial support for the Arab revolt, but not the deployment of British troops. He understood Arab sensitivities and knew that British troops deployed anywhere near the holy city of Mecca would be a serious offense. Having suffered defeats at Gallipoli and Kut, the British High Command was relieved to hear Lawrence's recommendation, since they had no troops to spare. Lawrence was appointed as Faisal's military advisor. His task was to ensure that the course of the Arab revolt met with British interests. To Lawrence, this was an opportunity to fulfill his dream of uniting 20 million Arabs as a single nation, therefore foiling French hopes of gaining a foothold in Syria. As he wrote at the time, "It's a big game, and at last, one worth playing." But the Arab revolt was chronically short of money, so Lawrence became the conduit for British gold to maintain the cohesion of the disparate tribes that made up the Arab army. It also bolstered his own prestige. The Arabs believed only a top person could distribute such generous amounts of gold sovereigns, as well as weapons and ammunition to fight the Turks. The size of the Arab army fluctuated greatly, with men constantly leaving and returning depending on the whim of their tribal leaders. But in a few months, under Lawrence's guidance, the Arab army grew into a formidable force. The British army trained them on weapons such as mortars and machine guns, and engineers showed them how to use explosives. Lieutenant Alec Kirkbride, who served with Lawrence, observed the strengths and weaknesses of the Arabs as fighting men.
You could get a terrific charge out of them. If it came off, that was splendid. If it didn't, well, they ran away. That seemed to be the only sensible thing to do. There was no point in staying there and being killed. If they happened to loot anything of value, then their idea was to get it to a place of safety at once, quite regardless of the effect that their absence would have on the battle. On the other hand, were the regulars, who were practically all men who'd served in the Turkish army and who had volunteered to join the Arab cause. And by doing so, of course, they put themselves in danger of being executed as traitors. They, indeed, were the backbone of the whole movement.
Since the Arabs associated khakis with Turkish army uniforms, Prince Faisal suggested to Lawrence that he wear Arab clothes so that the troops would recognize him as one of their leaders. With his fluent Arabic, camel-riding prowess, and his phenomenal powers of endurance, Lawrence now lived completely as a Bedouin. Lawrence recognized quickly that the strength of the Arab army lay in its ability to wage guerrilla warfare, to use hit-and-run tactics rather than attack Turkish fortified positions. Lawrence wrote, "Most wars were wars of contact. Ours should be a war of detachment. We were to contain the enemy by the silent threat of a vast, unknown desert." On this desert stage were some remarkable characters, such as the sheikh of the Arab Hawita tribe, Auda Abu Tayyi. Lawrence observed, "We'd heard much of Auda. He'd married 28 times and been wounded 13 times. He himself had slain 75 men, Arabs, with his own hand in battle. But the number of dead Turks he could give no account. They didn't enter the register. Auda was the greatest fighting man in northern Arabia." And it was into Hawita territory that Prince Faisal and Lawrence intended the Arab army to advance and take the war to the Turks. For Lawrence, his hour had come, and the raids for which he would gain immortal fame were about to unfold. On January 3, 1917, the reinvigorated Arab army set off from Yenbo for the port of Al-Wajr, further up the coastline of the Red Sea. With Faisal and Lawrence at their head, a vast sea of men on camels and horses surrounded the town and laid siege to the Turkish garrison. Supported by British gunboats and a detachment of Royal Marines, Al-Wajr fell to the Arabs 3 weeks later. As was customary, the Arab army then looted the town, gathering the spoils. Al-Wajr became the main supply port for the Arab army and the base for further operations against the Turks. Lawrence decided to mount a series of sabotage attacks against the Hejaz railway line serving the Turkish garrisons in the region. But as a classic guerrilla fighter, he cautioned, "We must not take Medina. The Turk was harmless there. In prison in Egypt, he would cost us food and guards. We wanted him to stay at Medina and every other distant place in the largest numbers. Our ideal was to keep his railway just working, but only just, with the maximum loss and discomfort. He was welcome to the Hejaz Railway and the Transjordan Railway and the Palestine and Syria railways for the duration of the war, so long as he gave us the other 999,000th of the Arab world." By these means, thousands of Turkish troops remained idle in the towns of the region and in the numerous outposts dotted along the railway line. Stuck in the Hejaz, they were unable to influence events in Palestine. The British Army was still making little headway against the Turks in the coastal town of Gaza. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the British avenged the defeat at Kut and captured Baghdad in March. In May, Lawrence laid the plans for his most ambitious attack yet. He and Faisal wanted to extend the revolt northward all the way to Damascus. But first, they had to capture the port of Aqaba at the northern end of the Red Sea. Aqaba would be a staging post and supply depot for further operations. But the Turks had constructed virtually impregnable defensive lines in the high ground behind the town, and any attack from the sea was likely to meet the same fate as that of the Allies at Gallipoli. So Lawrence decided to take an indirect approach by attacking the Turkish defenses from the rear, out of one of the most inhospitable deserts on earth. Together with the redoubtable warrior Auda, Lawrence and a small band of men set forth into the burning furnace of the Arabian desert. On this epic 2-month journey, he endured dysentery, malaria, and ulcerated saddle sores. As they came closer to Aqaba, Auda decided to raise more troops for the coming assault on the port. Meanwhile, Lawrence made a daring reconnaissance trip to Damascus to gauge the opinion of urban Arabs on the revolt in Arabia. On his return, the attack on the Turkish positions behind Aqaba took place with great success, and the port was captured within a day. Lawrence's indirect approach strategy worked. Fearing a Turkish counterattack, Lawrence immediately set off alone on a 150-mile camel ride to Egypt to obtain reinforcements and supplies from the British. Lawrence then went into Cairo to share news of the victory. He became an instant hero and was recommended for a Victoria Cross. But instead, he was awarded the Commander of the Bath, since no British officer was present to witness his deeds on the battlefield. The new British commander in the Near East, General Edmund Allenby, was impressed by Lawrence's exploits and immediately authorized greater support for the Arab revolt. Lawrence took advantage of the goodwill and submitted a long list of needs, including supplies and money for the Arab cause. It was not unusual for Lawrence to handle sums of up to £200,000 in order to finance the Arab revolt, a sum equivalent to $7 million today. But Allenby also provided heavier weapons, including Rolls-Royce armored cars with British crews and close support aircraft manned by the Royal Flying Corps. With these weapons, Lawrence was able to mount far more effective raids on the Hejaz Railroad. And from September 1917 onward, he cut the line repeatedly. Although he had Royal Engineer specialists to blow up the lines, Lawrence delighted in the task himself. He enjoyed packing in more explosives for a spectacular detonation. This was not popular with his British Army engineers.
I didn't approve of Lawrence's methods of blowing things up. He wasn't trained as a sapper, and he liked to make as big a bang as possible. He wasted a great deal of the explosives that had been brought at great trouble on camelback for hundreds of miles. And on this occasion, he put everything he could lay his hand on under the bridge. Knowing his habits, I said, "Now, please, sir, give me a little warning before you fire your charges. Let me get my men away." He said, "Oh, yes, all right, don't fuss, don't fuss." So we went down, and I was quite happily putting my charges in, and suddenly there was a most terrific bang, and the bridge flew into the air and fell all over the station. I was absolutely furious as a subaltern could be with a colonel, which had its limits. And he sat on a boulder and laughed at me.
The many raids conducted by Lawrence against the Turkish lines of communication played a crucial part in Allenby's subsequent victory over the Turkish army in the Battle of Megiddo. But Lawrence soon became distressed by the extent of the trust that Faisal and the Bedouin had placed on his word as a British officer. He had recently been made aware of the Allies' plan for the post-war Near East. It became known that the British and the French had made a secret pact in 1916 to create their respective zones of influence at the expense of Arab independence. Lawrence wrote, "Not being a perfect fool, I could see that if we won the war, the promises to the Arabs were dead paper. Had I been an honorable advisor, I would have sent my men home and not let them risk their lives for such stuff. Yet the Arab inspiration was our main tool in winning the Eastern War. So I assured them that England kept her word in letter and spirit. In his comfort they performed their fine things, but of course instead of being proud of what we did together, I was continually and bitterly ashamed." His sense of personal integrity and strong Christian upbringing was outraged by the demands of his devious double life. But first and foremost, Lawrence was a true patriot, and as he wrote at the time, "There was no escape for me. I must take up again my mantle of fraud in the East. With my certain contempt for half measures, I took it up quickly and wrapped myself in it completely." On November 6th, Allenby mounted another assault on Ghazni. This time, the Australian Light Horse swept the Turks back into the Judean hills in one of the last great cavalry charges in history. Simultaneously, Lawrence undertook a diversionary raid on the Turkish lines of communication in the Yarmouk Gorge, west of Dira. And it was in the town of Dira that Lawrence was to face the most traumatic experience of his life. While planning another raid on the important railway junction at Dira, Lawrence slipped into the town on a reconnaissance disguised as a light-skinned Circassian Arab. He was spotted by a Turkish guard and arrested. Brought before the local commander or bey, he was whipped, tortured, and abused. Early the next morning, he was able to escape, but the mental scars of his debasement would remain with him for the rest of his life. At the time, he told no one of the event, but those close to him noticed a change in his demeanor. His moods became darker, and the sense of humor that had sustained his companions throughout the campaign deserted him. However, 3 weeks later, on December 11th, he was present at the triumphal entry of General Allenby and his army into Jerusalem. Dressed in a borrowed army uniform, his diminutive stature of just 5 feet 5 inches was readily apparent among his fellow officers, though it was less obvious among the compact Bedouin with whom he fought. It was in Jerusalem that Lawrence met a man who would have a huge impact on his life, the American journalist Lowell Thomas.
I met Lawrence in Jerusalem. Allenby had called him in from the desert to decorate him in front of the Tower of David. I encountered Lawrence first on one of the narrow streets. He was with some Arabs. He didn't look like an Arab to me. And a little bit later, I got in touch with the British military governor of Jerusalem. I called him the successor to Pontius Pilate, Sir Ronald Storrs. And I told Storrs about this group of Arabs, and one who was a blonde wondered who he was. And Storrs opened a door to an adjoining room, and there he was. And Storrs was the one who was responsible for labeling Lawrence, because he said to me, "I want you to meet the uncrowned king of Arabia."
And with that, the legend of Lawrence of Arabia was born. In early 1918, Allenby renewed his offensive against the Turks with the intention of capturing the strategic city of Damascus. In support of these operations, Lawrence fought one of his most decisive battles at Tafila, where he crushed 3 Turkish infantry battalions. In a brilliantly executed cavalry charge, 900 Turks and all their guns and baggage were trapped in a narrow valley. During the headlong charge, Lawrence inadvertently shot his own camel in the back of the head with his revolver. The animal died instantly, and Lawrence was flung to the ground and knocked unconscious. "400 Turks were killed and 250 taken prisoner. The others fled in disarray." For his exploits in the Battle of Tafila, Lawrence was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. During the advance on Damascus, Lawrence incorporated British Army troops into his forces, and as always, his powers of leadership were inspirational.
Lawrence, of course, was not militaristic in the ordinary sense. I think this is what endeared him to us. No staff college training. He was just a natural guerrilla leader with a thorough knowledge of the country, its people, its languages, its customs. The whole of the Camel Corps, or at least the whole of those of us who served with him, absolutely worshipped him. And later on, of course, he personally reconnoitered every one of our objectives before we were committed to the attack.
By now, the Turks were in headlong retreat, and on several occasions they massacred innocent Arabs sheltering from the fighting. In the village of Tafas, on September 27, 1918, retreating Turks barbarically butchered women and children. Lawrence and the Arab army were not far behind. They exacted an awful revenge. Lawrence later wrote, "By my order, we took no prisoners for the only time in our war." In the madness born of the horror of Tafas, we killed and killed, even blowing in the heads of the fallen and the animals, as though their deaths and running blood could slake our agony. By now, Lawrence was a lieutenant colonel, but as the Allied forces neared Damascus, he determined to play one more card for the Arab cause. On October 1st, 1918, he rushed the city with his Bedouin warriors in the hope that an Arab administration could be installed before the arrival of the French. It was to no avail. The urban and desert Arabs could not resolve their differences except for their hatred of the Turks, who were butchered unmercifully. Australian troops entered the chaotic city and tried to restore some semblance of order. When General Allenby arrived, he quickly disabused Prince Faisal of any Arab aspirations for independence. Insult was added to injury by using Lawrence as the official interpreter. It was too much for Lawrence. The years of mental anguish and physical hardship had taken their toll. Malaria, dysentery, and the festering sores from months on Camelback had left him a shadow of his former robust self. He now weighed less than 100 pounds. He made the only personal request of his army career when he asked General Allenby for permission to go home. Lawrence's dream of an independent Arab nation lay in ruins. Lawrence returned to the family home in Oxford, but it was not the same. He had lost 2 brothers in the war, and for all his own efforts, he would not see an independent Arab nation. But Lawrence remained dogged. He immediately bombarded the government with his proposals for the Arab world after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He still sought a united Arab kingdom that would be aligned with the British Empire, but as far as the British government was concerned, this was never a consideration. It was only through Lawrence's personal efforts that Prince Faisal was even given a seat at the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference, where the fate of the Middle East would be decided. Of the victorious nations, the French had made the greatest sacrifices, and they now expected the greatest spoils. These included the newly formed countries of Lebanon and Syria. Britain acquired Palestine, the Transjordan, and Mesopotamia. Britain and France carved up the region between them and set the seal for the continuing troubles in the Middle East. Lawrence's political solution would probably have avoided many of the wars that were to come and saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the lands that he had served so nobly. Meanwhile, Lowell Thomas's film of the war in the Near East with Lawrence cast as the hero was shown to the world. And the legend of Lawrence of Arabia was born. At first, Lawrence was amused by the growing public attention, as he hoped it would advance the Arab cause, but he became increasingly disenchanted with the constant publicity. He escaped to Oxford University to complete his account of the Arab revolt, but he was devastated when the first draft of the book was mislaid during a train journey. Lawrence withdrew to the attic of a friend's apartment in London and rewrote the book from memory. He wrote up to 5,000 words a day, denying himself sleep or any human contact. The Seven Pillars of Wisdom was a literary masterpiece that assured Lawrence even greater fame as a writer. In 1920, Lawrence was invited to become a special advisor on Arab affairs to Winston Churchill. Churchill had recently been appointed colonial secretary, responsible for resolving the emerging crisis in the Middle East. In March 1921, it was determined at the Cairo conference that Prince Faisal would become the king of Iraq, and his brother Abdullah, the ruler of Jordan. For the next 15 months, Lawrence continued to champion the Arab cause until he believed he had fulfilled his promises to the Arabs. He decided to retire from public life and live quietly as a basic ranker in the Royal Air Force under the assumed name of John Hume Ross. But the anonymity and peace he craved proved elusive. Within months, his true identity was exposed by the national press, and the RAF asked him to leave. Lawrence then joined the Royal Tank Corps as Private Shaw at Bovington Camp in Dorset. But Army life was not for him, and he rejoined the RAF as Aircraftsman Shaw. In 1926, he was posted to India, where the Royal Air Force and the Army were conducting a campaign against the hostile tribes of the northwest frontier. But even there, Lawrence found no escape from the press, who believed that he was a master spy, promoting a revolt in neighboring Afghanistan to incite a war with Russia. Similarly, the French believed that the former desert raider was encouraging insurrection among the native tribes in French North Africa. It was too much for the British government. The RAF tried to smuggle Lawrence back to Britain unnoticed, but the press and newsreels were waiting. In March 1935, Lawrence retired from the Royal Air Force and returned to his simple cottage in Dorset, Clouds Hill. There he planned to set up a printing press and pursue a literary career. It was not to be. On May 13th, Lawrence was riding his motorcycle near his home when he swerved to avoid two boys on bicycles and crashed. For 6 days, he lay in a coma. He never recovered consciousness. Lawrence was just 46 years old at the time of his death. The great and the good came to his simple funeral at a small country church near his home in Dorset. T.E. Lawrence was a man of amazing versatility and talents. He was a pioneering archaeologist and military historian, a Greek scholar and fellow of Oxford University, an acknowledged literary critic and best-selling writer, an intelligence expert and guerrilla leader, a dedicated diplomat and innovative military thinker. It was a remarkable list of achievements for a lifetime cut short. Above all, Lawrence was an inspirational leader of such charisma that everyone that met him was seduced by his personality. He was equally at ease in the company of princes or privates, of politicians or paupers. Lawrence held no prejudice as to creed, class, or sex. And as Lawrence of Arabia, he was the greatest raider of his era.